We're going to be talking today about nonprofit boards and public boards, to some extent about business boards, though I really won't focus on them. I'd like to set the stage for that, however, by drawing your attention to how big an area this issue is. Nonprofit boards by themselves spend in the United States and Canada over $1 billion a year. If you add to that the amount of expenditure by public boards that we're talking about today as well, school boards, city councils, etc., we're talking about a huge slice of life in North America controlled by boards just like yours. The topic today is really a new technology of governance, and I'm using that kind of terminology because I don't want to be heard as saying this is about tips. This is not about tips, a way in which your board can operate a little better than it did before. That's not what we're doing. It's really a conceptual shift, a way of looking at the board's job and the relation of the board and its staff in a new kind of way. Now that means a number of things. It means this is not just for boards in trouble. It'll work for boards in trouble, but we're really talking about boards that are already doing well but want to move to a whole new level of leadership. I'm also not saying, I'm giving you a lot of knots here because I want to clear these out of the way, that nonprofit and public boards should act, quote, like a business, unquote. You hear that a lot. Basically, business boards are flawed in usually some different ways, but terribly flawed themselves. So my message to you is not that we need to make our nonprofit and public boards more like business boards, but that boards everywhere should get to a deeper level of what governance is all about. And for that reason, the kind of work that I've done applies to business and nonprofit. But one of the things that boards have done, because we haven't in the past developed much of the technology of government, is they've tried to mimic administration. That is, boards have taken materials, documents, and such from administrators and imported those things right into the boardroom. So it's not surprising to find that boards end up being administrators one step removed, at least half the time. We use the same terminology, we use the same reporting methods, and so forth. And while that may not sound like a problem at this point in the presentation, as we go along, you'll see it's quite a problem indeed. We need a technology of governance itself because it's a very special part of the management spectrum. Well, where I start to deal with this is back at the beginning role of the board, the beginning position of a board in the scheme of things. And that position is that the board is there as an owner. It owns the organization on behalf, usually, of someone else. That is, the board has a trusteeship function. It's a trustee-type owner. So what's new about that, right? Well, I'll tell you what becomes important if you really take that point of view. All of a sudden, the board is not there to help the staff. It's there to own the business. It's not there as helpers, but owners. Now, that doesn't mean board members can't help individually. They can. But the board as a body has its primary calling in owning the business, not doing what staff needs to have done. It changes our idea about volunteerism. Most nonprofit boards, for example, are not paid, and therefore they think of themselves as volunteers. Be careful about that, because the volunteer mentality, while it's true, you're not being paid, certainly, the volunteer mentality brings that we're here to help kind of idea to the fore. You are there as owner representatives. You're not there to help. Stop seeing yourselves as volunteers. You are, in the sense of community boards, civic trustees, to use a term someone else contributed to the literature. Well, another thing this means, this ownership trustee idea, it means that the board's primary relationship is not to its staff, but to these owners. The primary relationship is not to your staff, but to the people who, in a moral sense, if no other way, own your organization. Now, having made a point of the ownership idea, I need to expand on that a little bit. Let's look at ownership. Let's look at what that means in a given organization. There, on your screen, you'll find a regular table of organization. Looks pretty common except for what I've stuck on top of it. The board works for somebody else, and that somebody else is the ownership. Now, it's easy to describe the ownership in some cases. Let's look at some of those. We'll throw up the next slide. See, in a civic club board, for example, it's so simple to see that the membership of the civic club is the owner group. That's the group of ownership. Let's see the next one. A federation board. Now, a federation board would be one where the board or the organization over which you're governing is really a federation or a collection of other organizations. In that case, all those other organizations taken together are the ownership. Let's see the next one. Here we have a city council. A city council is pretty easy, isn't it? It's the citizens of a city. They're the ownership, no doubt about that. Let's look at the next one, because the next one points out that it isn't always that easy. A public classical radio station. Who's the owner? Classical music buffs? Donors? People in the listening area? Who is it exactly? It gets fuzzy, doesn't it? So my point here is not to say that figuring out who the ownership is always easy. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But it's terribly important as a concept, because board members have to think of themselves as acting on those people's behalf. They're even acting on the owner's behalf more than clients' or customers' behalf, because it's operating out of that primary connection to the owners that the board decides who the customers will be even, who the clients will be, whom are we here to serve, and so forth. That's a secondary decision. The first decision comes right out of the ownership. Go ahead and flip it over there if you will, David. Here's the principle. The board owns the organization on behalf of this ownership, whomever that might be, and to whom the board owes a primary accountability. Now, having said that, we've set the stage. The board is in the ownership position on behalf of its this trusteeship. And now let's turn inward to where we usually start, and that is with the board's relationship with the staff. The board, obviously, since it's sitting on top of the organization, is totally accountable for that organization. Now, we all know that. On the other hand, we sometimes act as if we don't know that. Now, the staff does something, the board says, we didn't do that, staff did it, as if the board had nothing to say about it. That total accountability is rather scary because it means legal accountability, moral accountability, all kinds of accountability, any way you want to cut it. And for a part-time body, which most boards are, trying to keep up with a whole lot going on, that's a rather scary spot to be in. You know, some board members get on a board to begin with, and they're right off the bat struck with how much is going on and how hard it is to keep up with it. Sometimes they spend a lot of energy trying to keep up, and usually we say, give us more reports. We want to read more. We want to visit more sites, and whatever you do to try to keep up. And the problem is, there is so much to keep up with that it truly could be said that if you really can keep up with everything that's going on, there's not enough going on. So what you need to do is to figure out what you need to keep up with, not try to keep up with everything. Well, wait a minute, I've spoken too soon, haven't I? Because even if you kept up with everything, if you could do that, there's not an ounce of leading in keeping up with. There simply is no leading in that. So let's look at how a board might lead, not just keep up with. And one idea that's been around a long time is the idea that a board can lead with policies. The board ought to be policy makers, not the ones who dabble in all the bits and pieces. But the problem is that we haven't been real sure what policy means. You look at some of the things we call policy and you see what I'm talking about. Let's define policy. I'm going to give you a definition that I'll live with for the rest of this teleconference. The definition is simply this, that a policy is the value or perspective, meaning by perspective I mean a way of looking at something, the value or perspective that underlies action. And that's all I'm meaning by the word policy. It's a very simple definition, that which underlies what we actually go out and do, the value that we hold, the perspective that we have. Now, having said that, I've just introduced another problem, you see, because you can't be a living human being and not be making policy all the time. You can't do it. We're always acting out of some kind of values. So everybody in the organization makes policy, not just the board. It would seem that I've just muddied the waters by saying that, isn't it? So let's look for a while now at what kinds of things a board makes policy about in order to make this work. Well, I'm going to look at one category of policies first, and this category deals with what difference are we trying to make. You know, when the board is dealing with the questions about what difference are we setting out to make happen, it's dealing with something I call ends. Now here's what I mean by ends. I mean what benefit or what change, what good is going to occur for whom, for which people, and at what cost. In other words, what is the swap that we have with the world? We cause the world to be different. Somebody's better off than they were before in some way. In some particular kind of better off. And it costs the world something to get that. That's the swap the organization has with the world. That's an ends issue. And whenever the board is directly addressing, remember, directly addressing those, who's going to be better off, how are they better off, and what cost? It is dealing with ends issues. Now I'm going to hold that aside as one category of policies. The difference you're going to make. Now since I call those ends, then obviously you know where I'm going next, right? I'm going to call the next ones means. Now by means, what I intend to say are the activities, practices, the kinds of busyness we engage in, the conduct the conduct of the business, the kind of things that are on your screen right now are a good example of that. Those are the means. So we're not talking about ends, we're talking about means. I mean these to be exhaustive categories. But now why am I separating these two? I mean, obviously it's easy to separate those two in our minds, but why am I making a thing out of it? Because if a board treats ends and means differently, it has access to the most powerful single principle your board will ever have to do its job. The ends means principle is this. Now here's what you do different about ends and means, all right? You say what they shall be, the ends, but as far as this means, stay out of them, except to say what's not okay. Now if that sounds strange to you, then you're hearing me right. It is a little strange. Let me look at this by using a drawing in which we have a target, and we'll pretend that target is the ends that a board has determined. Here's the difference this organization is going to make. And I'm going to show you some arrows coming at that target. Now by the arrows, what I'm really, my analogy here is the arrows are different ways of coming at the target. Different staffing patterns, different ways of supervision, different ways of arranging budgeting, things like that. All right? Now the board in this case is saying the ends are what's important here, and the means are what it takes to get there, and we have a staff ostensibly hired because they know how to manipulate means. They know how to get things done. Now this principle that I just threw up would have this picture be augmented by some little barriers. Let's put the barriers up on the screen. Here the barriers are saying, get there any way you can. We don't care how you come at it, which one of these arrows you use. We don't care how you make that target get hit. But don't come in such a way that you cross one of these barriers. That's the don't do it list. So when I said stay out of the means except to say what you won't put up with, those barriers might say don't break the law. They may say any number of things that the board says, we don't care how you do it. But we certainly have some things we'd be very disapproving of if you did. Now that's simple enough. That's the principle. But let me contrast that to what we're used to, what we usually see. Give me the drawing with the windows. Because usually what we find, and those of you who've received grants from levels of government would find this in your grants too, the money comes to you for certain purposes. Let's say those are ends for a minute, but it turns out they usually aren't. And with all kinds of instructions about how to carry out what you do. We have a school superintendent in the audience here today who knows very well the state and other people tell him how to do everything under the sun. All the how-tos are prescribed. And notice that's an exact opposite of the principle I was giving you. Notice what happens. We set out to hit those windows because you're trying to do what your grantors or the law tells you to do. And now we try to hit the other window because the people who line up, who state the windows for us, don't always talk to each other. And then we find out that we put so much effort in hitting the windows and doing things the way somebody said to do them. They prescribe the means, quite to the contrary of what I'm saying, they prescribe the means. That we find the emphasis comes off the ends and ploop, the whole thing falls because our emphasis was on doing things the way somebody told us to do, not producing the results the money was intended to produce. Now I've just described the public education system in the United States and Canada. I've also described a lot of social service agencies, wherein the emphasis becomes doing things in a righteous way as opposed to accomplish something worth the money. That's absolutely frightening. Absolutely frightening, and yet that kind of disease, that prescribe the end, prescribe the means, which is the opposite from what I'm saying, don't worry about the ends, they'll come out, we hope, that undermines the integrity and the utility of our public and nonprofit organizations throughout North America. Well, let's look at this another way. Let me present this ends means thing another way. Graphic 8 will show us a chief executive officer. Now, you have to look at this one for a minute to figure it out. The chief executive officer here is operating the organization, and if you throw the next one up, you'll see under the CEO all kinds of things are taking place, the little arrows, all kinds of activities are going on. But notice in the way I'm presenting it, in the new approach, we don't really care what's going on with all those activities in the organization. This should come as some relief to a lot of you board members who are reading yourselves to death. You don't have to keep up with everything that's going on, because what matters is that those activities, and now throw up the next graphic if you will, those activities end up creating the ends you had in mind. That is, where they come out makes a difference. What they were individually doesn't. And they stay within these boundaries that the board has set in its list of don't do it's. All right? So the board now has set the ends affirmatively. It has stated the boundaries in terms of don't get outside these, Chief Executive Officer. And now the board's able to back off and let the activity within be whatever it is, as long as it passes the test of producing what we wanted to produce and stay within these boundaries that we've given you, which, by the way, always end up being prudence and ethics kinds of boundaries. Where have I gotten to? Yes, David, I think I'm lost. All right. Let's add one more piece to this because I'm leaving something out. I intended to, by the way, until this point, and that is there are some means that the board itself owns. Not the staff's means, but the board's own means. For example, if a board chose to govern the way I'm telling you about today, that would be a means decision of the board. If the board chose to have committees, not to have committees, to have officers or not have officers, to define their role this way or that way, those are board's own means. So let me take the idea now of ends and staff means and add to that board means, and I'm even going to divide that one into two parts. I'll make this clear in just a second. Then let's throw up on the screen the 4 policy categories that have just been created. 2 of the categories, ends and means, are instructive to the CEO. Now I'm going to call that means a little different in a minute. The board's dealing with the CEO's means, yes, but it's dealing with them in a limiting kind of way, so I may refer to those as executive limitations a little later. The board's own means I'm dividing into 2 parts. Those means that deal with the governance process itself, how you govern, like the examples I gave you a minute ago, and those means that deal with how the board passes power to a chief executive officer or to a staff and how it knows that power is well used, monitoring kinds of things. So we have 4 categories in the white on your screen, the 4 categories of board policies that I've just created, and the secret here is that those exhaust everything the board needs to say. So every pronouncement of this board, everything it needs to come out with, fits in one of those categories someplace. So hold that in your minds for a while, those 4 categories of board policies, which are intended, by the way, to replace everything else the board is now saying. All its plans, all its budgets, all its other policies, all its practices, everything. They're replaced by these 4 categories. And by the way, they're much more succinct, take much, much less paper. So let's jump to another kind of idea, because in each of those categories, we could find a little more confusion available to us by seeing that there are big questions and little questions in each category. In ends, for example, the mission, that's a big ends question. What we're going to make happen for a particular customer or client next week, that's an ends question too, but it's a very small one. Now, how do we get all that together? Well, try this idea. Consider mixing bowls or cardboard boxes stacked up the way the screen shows them right now. When you have a nested set, the pieces fit within, the smaller pieces fit within larger pieces. And if you really want to control that nested set, like when you pick up a set of mixing bowls, you control the outermost one. That's the one you touch, not the other ones, just the outermost one. And what happens when you do that is the ones inside can flop back and forth a bit. There's some latitude. If you watch the screen, I think they'll show you the flopping around here a little bit. But these boxes can fall in different kinds of places. But notice what they didn't do. They didn't get outside the first one. In that case, the control of the box carrier is over the first box, and the other ones are allowed to vary. You could, of course, want to control more than that, so you reach in and grab the second box, you could do that kind of thing and pull them over to one side, but there's still variation left within that. So the point I'm making here is not really about cardboard boxes and mixing bowls. It's about the fact that if you stack up the decisions or the issues or the values in the organization within these 4 categories that I've given you, but stack them up from large to small, which I grant you is hard to do if you were starting from scratch doing it, then the board needs to control the outermost or the biggest value in each category and work its way in, and that's what we'll display in a different way. Now, let me do this now with you, and then we'll use another graphic to illustrate it. I'm going to take the 4 categories of board policies, ends, the constraints on executive means, and so forth, arrange them like 4 sets of mixing bowls, or in this case saucers, pull them together so I can make a circle out of them. Now if you'll throw up the graphic 11, it looks like this. Here we have in each quadrant a set of these saucers, if you will, starting from the outside, the big one, coming into very tiny ones, and we have 4 different sets showing as the quadrants on the circle. So the circle now is going to be used as a little mechanical device to illustrate some things in a moment. So that the big stuff's on the outside, little stuff on the inside, and we have 4 different categories. Now, let's look at this idea of starting with the biggest bowl as a way of policy making. And give me graphic 2, because I want to make sure I'm sorry, graphic 12. If you want to throw off the people in the electronic part of one of these teleconferences, say something like I just did. Thank goodness they know not to pay any attention to me. They gave you the right one anyway. What we have here is an illustration of the boards using a very important principle as it makes policy. The colored part means the board has addressed it. It's stated something. The board has stated the biggest value in each of those quadrants here. That is, it's made, let's say, one sentence of policy is all it has at this point. It's decided the largest value in each category, and that's where it stops so far. A one-sentence mission, a one-sentence statement in the bottom right, which might have said, Chief Executive Officer, don't do anything unethical or imprudent. Pretty broad, isn't it? But that's the broadest where you start, all right? Now, the board will have created these 4 sentences. Let's look to see what sentences of this sort might look like. Give me 12A or whichever one is next. The principle 3, just a minute. Pull it all the way out. Okay, that's a summary of what I just said. And now let's go immediately on to graphic A. In graphic A, what you're going to see is the board has stated a one-sentence, go ahead to graphic A, the board has stated one sentence of what its ends are all about. It's like at a mission level. Here's a policy sample. Now here's a cancer fund, which is in the research business, basically, saying this is what we exist for. Very broadly stated. Now they could have expanded that, of course. They could have said, wait a minute, that's too broad. We're going to come in further to a lower bowl, if you will, and we'll come in to say one of the parts of that we expand upon further is that we're going to create the basic knowledge of the biology of cancer. That would be a sub-part of this, that they're going further to describe what they mean here. Let's look at the next one. Graphic B will show a policy in which the board is saying to the staff, there's certain treatment of people that's not okay here. And this is said in a broad term, very broad terminology, you'll see. Now this board that produced this said the only thing we wish to control about the way staff is treated is this kind of thing. That's it. And we say it broadly. And of course they could expand upon it. They could say, look, don't something that if you come into a smaller level, what that means to us is don't allow staff to have to live or work in unsafe or unhealthy conditions. That would further expand it. But in this case, they left it broad. Let's look at a list of the typical kinds of things boards usually choose to restrict staff about within this executive limitations or staff limitations policy area. What you're seeing is a list of the typical kinds of policies. So the board usually says to the staff, here are some ways of treating yourselves, treating staff that are not okay with us. Here are some ways of budgeting, some characteristics of budgeting that would not be passable with us, and so forth. The board is putting limits around these means. Nothing on that list you just saw was an ends issue. They were all means issues. So the board is saying to the staff, do it any way you want to, but here are some characteristics or aspects or ways in which you might do those things that would not be okay. Let's go on to graphic C, where the governance process category is being dealt with. And here the board still using the very broad outside kind of statement. And you can read that saying, here's the kind of board we're going to be. It could have expanded upon that. It might, at a smaller level, for example, say we're going to regularly monitor our own performance. That's a part that implies, and we might get to the smaller bowl, so to speak, to say that, or we might not. Let's go to the next one, wherein the board is setting up its basic policy in the board-staff relationship. Notice how simple this one is, but it sets the stage, and the board can further expand it. For example, it might expand it to say the Chief Executive Officer is authorized to make all decisions which are within a reasonable interpretation of the board's words. That might be a further expansion of that. The board would take its further expansion, so to speak, and give them numbered status underneath that, so you end up with an outline-looking kind of policy. And you can see the different depths possible here because the board actually comes into whatever depth it needs to come into. Let's look at graphic 13, which shows the progression. The board now has left the outermost area. It has made policy in the broadest way, and then said, we want to say some more about that, just as I did in my expansions of what they might add. We want to say some more about those things, and we're going to come in a little further and stop someplace. Now we'll talk in a second about how they know how to stop. But notice that progression from large to small. That kind of policy making on behalf of the board is extremely important. You don't just adopt a document or a policy which has large and small all mixed up in it. For example, like your budget. You start from the outside and you work in. And you work in one level at a time. Let's see the principle that states that for you. You work in one level at a time. Nothing stops the board from coming into smaller things here, but it has to come in smoothly. You don't jump from the big issue all the way into the little issue. That becomes off limits. Can't do that. Now, the problem, of course, comes up here is how do you know where to stop? Now, staff members get a little worried about that. My God, the board's going to keep coming in and coming in and coming in and coming in. They might as well have jumped in with both feet in the middle to start with. Well, it doesn't really come out that way if you use the discipline of coming in one at a time, because you wear yourselves out coming in. It takes a lot of energy to decide those big things well. And even the pickiest board will hit a point where they stop. And the stopping place is even further out than where boards stop now, given their discipline of jumping wherever they want to jump. Now, here's how you do it. Just like with the boxes, the board starts from the outside in and asks itself the question at each stage. Are we willing to let our Chief Executive Officer, I'll use that as the example, though I'll give you the chair as the example in a minute. Are we willing to let our Chief Executive Officer make any reasonable interpretation of the words we've used? Now, please notice when you're using the broad terminology way on the outside, there's a huge range of interpretation of those words. Huge range. But as you come in further to smaller levels of thought, the range of interpretation keeps shrinking. Just as if I said, I want a cup of coffee, and you bring me a cup of decaf, and that wasn't what I wanted. But that was a reasonable interpretation, wasn't it? But if I'd said I wanted decaf, and you bring me decaf, but it's not freshly brewed, that was still a reasonable interpretation, but the range has narrowed. The point here is the board needs to say what it needs to say, rather than just hoping somebody interprets it well. And as you come in on that circle, as you come into more detail, the amount of interpretation you're leaving to your Chief Executive Officer in the case of the ends and means goes down, down, down. And at some point, the majority of board members are willing to say, that's it, we're willing to accept any reasonable interpretation at this point. That's a sleeper of a rule, by the way. People don't notice how important that is till they get into it. You see, if you don't have that rule of allowing someone to make it an interpretation, then they have to come back to you as a board repeatedly to say, is this what you meant, is this what you meant, is this what you meant, and the board is right back in the soup again. It didn't have to be responsible for the words it used because it's going to get checked out anyway. This is like having a multiple of quality inspectors on a line, by the way. When you have a lot of quality inspectors, nobody has to make sure the quality is okay. So what happens is you get lower quality by having all those quality inspectors. Some of the work of Deming and others is bringing our attention to that in the last few years. Well, okay, let's look again at how the policies look then. Let me have graphic 16. That was the one with the uneven circle. So let's get a look at what that appears to be. You see, the board now has filled in policy from the outside in. But notice that there's some room in the middle. What about the area the board has not yet gotten to? On the right side, we treat that very different from the left side. On the right side, you see we're dealing with those instructive policies. And you can hold that next graphic for just a minute till I'm ready for it. I'm going to string this out a tad because I want to make sure you understand this. On the right side, we're using the instructive policies, the ones that tell the Chief Executive Officer something. On the left side, these are the board's own means where the board's basically talking pretty much to itself. That's not totally true, but it's more that. It's not instructing anybody to do anything on staff. So that the further decisions, the smaller decisions about ends, and the decisions that still remain about the means, the staff means, those belong to the Chief Executive Officer. On the left side, the smaller decisions, if you will, the ones the board didn't get around to, belong to the board chair, by whatever name you call that person, by the way. Now, go ahead and throw up the next graphic then, so we see the words there of chair and CEO. And let me point out something about that. You see, the chair now owns that territory within the board's policies on the left, and the CEO owns that territory within the board's policy on the right. And if the chair and the CEO, in their respective roles, make decisions which are consistent with what the board has said, then the chair and the CEO can make any decisions they want to make. Let me say that another way, because I'm going to say it's scary to start with. I'll say it with regard to the CEO. On the right side, any decision made by staff within that territory that says CEO is okay by definition. Any decision. But notice the important words in that sentence. Within. That is, the decisions have to be consistent with what the board has said about what we want, those are the ends, and what we don't want, those are the restrictions or the limitations on the means. Important thing about the drawing is that the chair, and you don't have to put it back up by the way, the chair does not show up on the right side and the chief executive officer doesn't show up on the left. Now that's very important because in this approach, the chief executive officer is working for the board, not for the chair of the board. And the chair of the board is working for the board, not being the board's chosen dictator. So that the jobs of chair and CEO now are adjacent jobs. One is not over the other. The chair has no more authority over the chief executive officer than any other board member, which of course is zero, because nobody on the board has any authority over the staff. The board as a whole has total authority. Individuals have none. And that's important because of the one voice characteristic that we'll get to in the second half of the teleconference. So it's very important for the chair to stay on the left and for the CEO to stay on the right. And look at what happens ordinarily. In the level of discipline that we often apply to board staff roles, it is pretty common for chairs to get themselves inserted into the decision process of staff. Very common. In fact, chairs playing that role become the CEO if they don't watch it, or if the board doesn't watch it. Although chairs almost never really become the CEO, they kind of become the CEO, now you see it, now you don't. You know, like the chair wants to be CEO about what the chair wants to be CEO about, but not the other things. So you have a partial, kind of halfway CEO role going on. My God, I couldn't tell you how common that is. And it happens because the board hasn't done its job. Don't blame the chair. The board must take responsibility for placing that CEO role where the board wishes it to be and cannot responsibly leave that up to whatever the chair wants to do at the time, because as you change chairs, one wants to operate back here, one wants to get his or her fingers in everything, and the board has just allowed bad governance to occur because of who the chair happens to be. All right? The board has to be responsible for that. So you put the CEO role where you need it to be, and for most nonprofit and public organizations, that should be in the top paid staff member, or the top paid staff member. Wouldn't have to be the top paid staff member. Look at it the other way though. The CEO often wanders over onto the left side. The CEO often inserts himself or herself into the board's process. Now boards invite this. Boards typically invite CEOs to be either milquetoast or manipulators, frankly. They say, push us around, tell us what to do, treat us like volunteers who came here to help, or lie down and let us walk on you. Let us intrude ourselves into your job. Let us take over the administration of this place by being, if you will, administrators one step removed when the board assembles. The CEO here has no more right to go over and intrude into the board process than the chair has the right to intrude into the staff process. Now, that needs a little more explanation too, though, because you see boards invite that, as I said. Let me give you an example of how it's invited. A challenge I give to boards a lot is to say, look, folks, if you will have the next 2 or 3 board meetings with your chief executive officer having no input into the agenda. I mean none. Totally silent. If you cannot have your board meetings still keep going relatively well under those conditions, you are not governing. You're expecting your staff to be more responsible for that governing take place than the governors themselves. And that's a very common situation. In other words, from that drawing, take a lot of things. Take the fact that you separate those roles out, that the board now gets much more responsible for getting its job done. The staff is left with the accountability for its job, but the power to do its job without interference. That is the way now that the policy making starts shaking out in terms of board staff relationships. I think it's time to go to questions.
From Northwestern Michigan College in Traverse City, We have this question, John. How should nonprofit boards get new members or replace members that have completed their term? I have a second question if you want to consider that for a moment.
Is it related?
It may be. It's because there were two questions here.
Well, let me take them one at a time.
Okay.
Let me take them one at a time. First of all, if your board is in the position of reducing its size, this may be a great opportunity not to replace them. You don't always get an opportunity to painlessly reduce the size of an oversized board. Now, I'm saying that without having established any context for what size works well, so maybe we'll deal with that part later, but let me just put that aside. Maybe it's best not to replace them at all. But now more to the point of the question. It's very important for the board, and you do this in that governance process section of policies, to talk about, deliberate, and to set down what is required for us to do a good job as a board. In other words, what are the characteristics, what are the gifts that we bring to this board that make it work? Because if you do that kind of discussion, it also tells you whom you're looking for new board members. We need to find people who have this kind of ability, this kind of approach, this kind of contact, whatever it is. And the board, having done that ahead of time, is doing two things at once. It's instructing itself, what gifts do we bring out when we get here? And it's also instructing its nominating or its searching process as to what kind of folks we're looking for. I make a point of that because it's very common for boards, particularly nonprofit boards, the non-elected sort, to get somebody on the board because, hey, I have an uncle who's not doing too much right now, and I'll bet that kind of stuff happens. That's very, very sad, actually. Or it's possible to go out and find people, and by saying, look, it won't take too much, one meeting a month, it's over in a couple of hours, no problem, and we do that kind of stuff to get people on the boards. Or we leave up to a nominating committee the job of figuring out what's needed without the board having been clear about what characteristics are we really looking for. You see, a board ought to be interested in the long term more than anybody else in the organization. And long term includes a lot of things, but right now what I'm getting at is it includes how can this board be a better board 5 years from now than it is now. And that may mean better selection procedures, it may mean the board has a better process, all of those things. So recruiting becomes terribly important, but it begins with the board discussing and setting down on paper, what are we looking for, not only in ourselves here on this board, but for new people. And then we go out and find them. Let's try that second one.
Okay, we've got a live caller on the line, John. So, caller, if you would say your name and where you're coming from, you can ask John now.
Yeah, hi there. My name is John Pegg. I'm calling from Superior, Wisconsin. And I'm curious to know, Dr. Carver, about the role of the CEO in terms of board development and working cooperatively and supportively with the chair and other board members.
Thank you very much, from Superior, Wisconsin. Yeah, the role of the CEO in board development. Yeah, it's just a comment about it. The CEO can be and is a tremendous asset to the board in its own development, no doubt about that. But let me twist that thought just a little bit. It is this: even though the CEO can be and should be a great help to a board in its own development, the board has to take on the primary responsibility for its own development. It's important that the board use whomever it can use to help it develop, but that the board never let go of its own primary responsibility that it be done. And I'm making the point because I want to separate two subtly close things, but separate them. One is that sometimes boards will expect the staff to be the source of what governance is all about, to tell the board what to do, to orient the new members and things like that, as if the board is a pawn in this. On the other hand, it would be silly, of course, for a board to take on its own development and try to do that totally by itself without getting any help from its staff. I mean, that would be a waste also, because the staff's a tremendous asset. My point is, split the middle here. Board, be responsible for your own development in such a way that you can never blame anybody else for your governing less well than you could. You can never blame the CEO, you can never blame the chair, you can never blame a committee that didn't get the job done, you can never blame anybody. You're it. The buck simply doesn't go any further than that. So the CEO can help with board development, right, but if the CEO is the source of and the bearer of the responsibility of, we have blown it.
We've got another caller, John, with a question for you. Go ahead, sir, and give us your name and the place you're calling from, please.
Dr. Carver, my name is David Friedman. I'm calling from New Orleans, Louisiana. And as a CEO, I understand totally that it's not my prerogative to make excursions into the left side of that circle. But I see that it would be very helpful to our whole operation to have your involvement and to have the board be aware of your principles. How do I get them involved without going over the circle line?
Years ago, I was asked to give a speech, thank you for that question, on managing your boss. Some of you have had the experience of having to manage your boss. You had a boss that didn't know how to manage, so you had to manage the boss. In a sense, that's what you're describing, and yes, that does happen. Let's face it. I think you have to really, as I think I'm hearing in the way you're using the words, to carefully use the judgment of, can I put into people's hands some principles, some ways of operating that lets them start exploring that or stretching their own bigness about it. And I don't see any problem with a CEO being a bigness stretcher, if you will. Not only about the governance process, but about ends issues. What are we all about? Are we thinking big enough? And a board can really use a CEO to help prod them in that way, as long as the board remembers it's their decision and they're representing the owners, not the CEO. So I would say go ahead and put the issues into the board's hands. You know, you have an adjacent job with the board chair, and I'm sure you have conversations with the board chair. Why not talk with the board chair about that and have the board chair be the entry point? That might clean up that issue for you.
John, we have a caller now from Phoenix. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Matt Madonna from Phoenix, and we're concerned here a little bit about where the volunteer involvement in program delivery fits into the model.
Okay, good question from Phoenix. Where does the involvement of the volunteer in the program delivery? Here's what I would recommend you do: that you take the interest of a person in your organization and put that into a helpfulness interest. There are the people who have a helpfulness interest. We want to help out, like volunteers usually do, and an ownership interest. Now, the ownership interest is expressed on the board. The helpfulness interest can be expressed anywhere. That is, the board will reach out for people to help it sometimes. Consultants about this, maybe in the community, who can help, maybe even without being paid. The staff reaches out for help because it wants to get as much of a job done with the money expended as possible, so it reaches out and uses volunteers. Those are two separate types of volunteers, two separate volunteer roles. If a board member, if Gene Doe or Pat Black on the board wants to also be the kind of volunteer of the second sort, there is no problem whatsoever with that, as long as Gene Doe or Pat Black is not wearing that governance hat when he or she comes over to the other role. So I would say that basically this governance model does not reduce in any way the ability to use volunteers in a massive kind of way. What it does do is to say, look, if you're on the board as a volunteer, while you're doing that, it's not like the other volunteer role. You're not there to help. Now, there are some people who can wear those two hats and keep them separated. Some can't. I'll say to board members, if you can't keep the hats separated, don't do it, because you may be causing more trouble than you're helping.
John, we've got a question from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Go ahead.
Louisiana's coming through this morning.
This is Georgianne Chafee from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. How can the board monitor or assess the chair's effectiveness and know where the board's efforts need to be addressed?
Beautiful question. Thank you. Thank you very much. To monitor the chair's effectiveness, the board needs to use a principle that I'll make a big point of that after our break, and that is the board has to first say what the chair's job is. What do we expect from the chair? My picture of the chair role is very much like a greeting card that I ran across once that said a friend is someone who learns the words of your song and sings them back when you forget. Well, see, a chair has a role of not only learning the board song, that is, its rules for itself. How do we use our own discipline? How do we stay a disciplined group? But cajoling the board sometimes into even producing those rules for itself. And when the chair has that in hand, now the chair can sing them back when the board forgets. So the chair's job is really a job which helps sort of the point person for the board, if you will, in helping the board get its job done. Not in supervising the chief executive officer, not in taking care of the staff itself, but in helping the board get its job done. Frankly, that's job enough for most boards. So what the board needs to be, in answer to the questioner's point, what the board needs to do is be very clear what's it asking of this chair, of any chair, and now let's have a way in which we occasionally, in some regular fashion, maybe it's annually, rate how we're doing on that.
Okay, John, now we have a question from Toronto.
Surprised to be on, are you?
Are we coming through?
You
yes,
are.
go right ahead. Well, you were coming through.
Right. Our question is with regard to ownership. A number of the boards represented here, or the people represented here, are from organizations where the ownership is not at all clear. We wondered if you had any ideas about some actual techniques or methods for helping clarify the fuzzy ownership question.
Well, I don't think I'm going to be very much help to you. Thanks, by the way, from Toronto. And I think the main thing you need to do is to be sure you don't let yourselves off the hook in solving the question. But the first thing I would worry about is not do we have a perfect way of doing it, but that we let ourselves off the hook. So be very careful you don't allow yourselves to see, for example, your customers or your clients as your ownership. They're a subpart of a total ownership. At that point, then use whatever techniques and brainstorming the board can use to figure out what is the legitimacy base we operate from. It might be a geographic base, in which case the answer falls out as a geographical area. It may be North York, or it may be Peterborough, or it may be a county someplace. Or it may be an interest group, all people who are interested in family planning, or something else. So I don't have an easy answer for you. I really wish I did. I certainly don't. I suggest you just keep working at it, because you see, if you talk about board effectiveness, there's an implication effectiveness in whose behalf. And this is the whose behalf people we're talking about. So it's terribly important. I wish I had an easy answer to do it in those cases where it's sloppy.
John, another ownership question from Evanston, Wyoming. Does ownership also lie where the funding for an organization comes from, or is it only with clients with whom we work in behalf of?
Okay, good. The question came in before my last answer, didn't it? And this may be helpful also to the Toronto questioner. I think it's very dangerous to see the funding body as the owner. It's easy to do it, and funding bodies sometimes help you do it. But I wouldn't do that if I were you, at least not until thinking it through. Most community organizations, I realize, by the way, that the nonprofit and public organizations who are listening and are watching on this teleconference are not all community organizations, but let me use those as an example for a minute. Most community organizations really are there because of an ownership feeling in their community. Now, how far community goes and things like that become fuzzy, as has just been pointed out. But that's where the ownership is. That's where the legitimacy is for that group. They reach out to a state or a province government, and they receive money for certain kinds of purposes, and it's very easy for that money flow to substitute for the local prerogative, the local ownership feeling. And for heaven's sakes, folks, even though the money may be coming from that source, that's not your owner. Look at it as if you were in the paving business and you pave private driveways, and you come to somebody's house and you say, "We want to pave your driveway," and you make a deal. You pave the driveway, they give you your money. Now, you know your livelihood comes from people who pay for getting their driveways paved. They are very important people. If they didn't exist and didn't want your services, you'd never make it. But you'd never for once think they're your owners. Not for once. And you need to have the same kind of approach to the funding base for your organizations. It may or may not be the owner.
We have another call now, John, from Tacoma, Washington. Would you go ahead in Tacoma?
Yes, Dr. Carver, I was wondering, what are the implications of the nominating committee, or now called the Board Operations Committee model, given your paradigm?
I'm not quite sure what is meant by the Operations Committee statement that you made, but the job of the nominating committee, should you choose to have it, there's no committee that a board has that it has to have, all right? So you always have a choice. If the board chooses to have a nominating committee, then what I would see that job as being, as going out and finding the people and working out the mechanisms for finding the people who have the characteristics that the board itself has outlined. That it has a go-do-it job. The board has the policy-making job there. The nominating committee has the go-do-it job. In this case, do it means find people who can fit the kind of characteristics needed to make this board work well into the future.
John, you now have a caller from South Dakota, so go ahead, please, from South Dakota.
Okay, I'm Susan Peterson. I'm calling from the University of South Dakota site in Sioux Falls. Our question is, how do you nudge your CEO back to his side of the pie and vice versa How do you get the board chair to go to his back to his side?
Oh, thank you for that. Maybe nudge is the wrong verb. Maybe it's too gentle. Let me assume something in the caller, for the caller. Let me assume you're speaking from a board perspective. That is, you're a board member or you're speaking for a board. How do we get these roles in place? I think the way you get them in place is by assuming as the board the fact that you have authority over those roles. Well, let's not play any games here. The CEO works for the board, not the other way around. And we ought at some point learn the chair works for the board, not the other way around too. But let's say the board has that in mind and really knows it. Now the board says, what do we want from the CEO and what's the role, and let's set this up on paper. Let's write it down. It doesn't take many words to do this. It really doesn't. Small amount of paper, but be really clear about it, and then line up everything we do consistent with that. Watch out for the last thing I said. Sometimes the board will say what it wants to do and then do everything else inconsistent with it. It's like when a board says, we're going to deal with a policy and let you do the management, and now come tell us why you hired somebody for that position. So we have to be consistent with it. I think if you have the policies in place and you're consistent, then you won't have to worry about nudging anybody anyplace. It will happen automatically. And if it doesn't happen, then you have a rather flagrant kind of situation. And the flagrant ones are easier to deal with, frankly.
We've got another telephone call.
Another
John?
telephone call. Let's hear it.
This one's from Calgary. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I really have two questions. Is there an ideal selection process for the nonprofit public board member? And how do you fire a volunteer board member?
Thank you from Calgary. I'll be landing there tomorrow afternoon, by the way. This is a good one. This is a good one. I'm going to have to assume that it's a board perspective being called in, okay? If it's the CEO wondering about how to fire the board member, that would be a rather different issue, and we have to deal with that separately. You don't. But from the board's perspective, I think a board, something about a board that makes it very difficult for everybody, and that is it's always hard for us to be disciplined in groups unless we have hierarchy. Put us into a platoon or a regiment, and I guess we can get disciplined in groups pretty fast, but put us into a group of peers like a board is, it's really hard to be disciplined. We haven't mastered that very well. So the board has to be really clear about how can we be disciplined, and that means what is the discipline required of us to get our jobs done? Discipline about attendance, for example. Discipline about who instructs staff. Discipline about, we'll talk about certain things, but other things we simply don't take board time to talk about. Those things have to be clear, and it does not take much paper to make them clear. Most boards will sort of let them be whatever they are instead of making them clear and writing them down and saying, this is the way we're going to operate. Well, when that's the case, when we haven't made those things clear, it's very easy, just based on the luck or lack of it, of who happened to be on the board, for things to be great or things to be awful because somebody's running off doing this or that. Renegade board members all over the place, and the renegade might be the chair, by the way. So what does a board do for that? Well, see, the problem is not in the renegades. The problem is that the board didn't have its discipline down pat before the renegade showed up. It's not the renegade who's the problem. Let me expand on that a second. That's too important to skip over. I have worked with boards wherein a given board member seems to be the sticking point. Everybody gets excited about doing something and one person grumbles and everything goes clunk. All the enthusiasm just went. I'll bet some of you have been on boards where you have one or two persons who cause the clunk every time you turn around. Now, the person causing the clunk may be right, by the way. We don't know that ahead of time. We're not omniscient enough to know the person's wrong. The person may be right. But the point is that that person isn't the problem. The problem is everybody else somehow gave up his or her responsibility to do what they think is best based on the fact that one person grumbled. So when renegades cause the problem, it's because the board as a whole has not said, look, let's get serious about what we're here for. We relate to staff in a certain kind of way. That's it. Anybody who wants to do it another way, staff doesn't have to pay any attention to them. I'd say it almost in those words. Like the board is obligated as a body to protect its staff from the board members as individuals. Obligated. And don't wait till you have a board member who's a problem to do that. Do it a long time before. How do you do it? It's so simple. Chief Executive Officer, you owe us as individuals courtesy. That's about it. But when we speak as a group, the law has just been laid down. And it goes from 0 to 100%, just like that. And a board needs to be so clear about that so that we don't have to worry about the renegade anymore. That doesn't mean the renegade just changed stripes. No, the renegade may still be renegade. but it doesn't cause much of a problem anymore. Staff doesn't pay any attention.
You've got a question now, John, waiting for you from Colorado Springs. Would you go ahead, please?
Hello. We're calling from the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, and one of our questions is, when the staff CEO find a need for the board to consider change in the policy, what is the relationship between the staff and the board? Can the staff suggest changes in policy?
Okay, thank you, from Colorado Springs. You see, the kind of board policy that's made in this model, we've already established that it's pretty succinct, not a lot of pages, not a lot of words involved, and that policy comes out of the board members. It generates out of the values of board members. It is not a kind of policy that the staff has worked up, taken it to the board to approve. That's not the way it works. It comes from the board members themselves. Now let's say a board has a policy that constrains or limits its chief executive officer in some way. It said, look, don't let the assets be unprotected and underinsured and so forth. In fact, we've even gone into more detail, another level in, and said don't let the insurance drop below 80% replacement cost, and don't let personnel have access to funds without being bonded, or that kind of level. Let's say we have a page of saying something like that. Let's say also the staff sees that, looks at that later on. Remember, the staff is involved as the board does it, not because they author it, but because the board says to staff, if we said that, what would be the implications? Because you need to know that. Not because the staff has the right to make the decision, but because it would be silly for us to operate without that information. So the staff has had a piece of this, a role in it, but not deciding it. And let's say, though, after a while the staff notices that, let's say something changes in the insurance world. I'll make this up, it's absolute fantasy. And all of a sudden 80% insurance isn't as standard a kind of thing as it used to be. Nobody's writing it anymore. If they do, it costs huge amounts of money, but you can get 75% replacement insurance at a reasonable cost. Now remember, this is fantasy, so give me a grain of salt here. The staff or the CEO would go to the board and say, folks, an assumption on which you created that first policy, an assumption that you had in mind, is not the truth anymore. Here's the new fact. Do with it as you will. I might hope you do this or that. But it's not we're giving the board facts and information about the implications of their policy, and the board should be able to count on its staff for doing that. But it's not a matter of the staff saying, I think it shouldn't only be 80%. I really think the smart thing to do is 90% or 100% replacement. They don't come to the board. They have the right to do it anyway. The board said don't drop below 80. They have the right to set the amount as long as it's not below 80. So they don't come to change the policy. They have the right to make their own decisions within that. They don't come back to the board to get the board to say what they have the right to say. So you stop a lot of board interaction wherein the staff is trying to put words in the board's mouth. Stops. Just stops. The board has given the staff a huge amount of authority to make decisions, but it's bounded authority, and then says, but we'll make our own decisions. Help us with the information about it, but we'll make those decisions. So the interplay between board and staff around policy making at the board level stops being one of making recommendations. You don't need a recommendation. You need to know what the options in front of the board are and what the implications of those options are. But recommendations, well, it's nice information, but it isn't important. Stops being important. Giving recommendations to the board about what the board is going to say becomes tantamount to the board approving staff operations. They're both getting your fingers in the other person's job.
John, we've got just a few seconds left and a very patient caller in Arizona, so quickly go ahead, Arizona.
Okay. Is there an ideal board size or at least a range of a good size for a board? And is it important that the board use a strict governance model, or can it be effective with some blending of the governance and the program decision model?
Thank you. In the few seconds we have left then, let me respond as quickly as I can. The size is also a variable. I don't think there's a right size. I really don't. But I would say that as the size gets bigger, it becomes much harder for the board to do its job well. So the rule of thumb that I use, and it's only a rule of thumb, is that anything over 7, have a good reason for. There may be reasons. It may be you're a 13-county area. Try having less than 13. See where that gets you. Counties are little fiefdoms. We know about that, don't we? So there might be, let's say every board member kicks in $100,000. Well, we don't want to push principle too far here, do we? So there are reasons, but by the way, a lot of people have big boards because of board members giving money and find out they got the big size, they didn't get the money. So be careful about that. We often let boards get way out of size. Public elected boards don't have that problem nearly as much as nonprofit social service boards. They tend to be very big, and federations, national groups, tend to have large boards too. Well, let's go back to where we left off in the first half, and welcome back. We had a graphic up. That's 17.1 for those of you who are the angels in the back room who handle all the electronics here. 17.1, remember that one? That's where we stopped, where we see the board operating at the highest levels of all of these topics and turning it over to somebody else at the lower levels, or the smaller bowl, so to speak. But let's take another look at this. If you look, let's say, in the lower right-hand quadrant, where we're dealing with the methods, means, practices of a staff, and the board here, of course, is speaking to the highest level of that, the big, broad issues of that, in a negative way. Don't let these kinds of things happen. That's not the way things are ordinarily done. So let us take a look for a minute at the way they're ordinarily done, just to draw the contrast. Let's have graphic 18, which shows us a matrix. I'm going to take two different kinds of topics here and look at those topics by levels. For example, across the top, I'm calling board issues. Anything across the top of this, that's like the outside part of the circle. Now, the board issues sit atop, if you will, or govern the CEO issues. And the CEO turns it over to other people. It says here, associate CEO issues. It could go for a long way through an organization. I've divided this into issues of personnel and issues of budget. Personnel and budgets tend to come up a whole lot, and what you're seeing on your screen right now, the oval, marks the way in which we usually organize these matters. We organize them vertically. That is, you'll have a document called a Personnel Policies Manual, or a document called a budget. And in these documents, we will have put the trivial and the profound, all mixed into the same document. In fact, you'll find more trivial than profound, because any topic is like that, right? There are a lot more of the little issues than the big sweeping issues. So when you see a document that a board often approves, that's what it has. It's put together vertically that way. Now, why does the board approve it at all? Well, it approves it because when you put all the material, the decisions that show up in that document into one document, and when it's put together as one monolithic piece, then of course we couldn't have the lowest person in the organization stamping it into existence. You couldn't do that. It's got to go all the way to the top. So in other words, the document, which has within it the trivial and the profound, has to be dealt with by the board. My goodness, what happens here? In order for the board to deal appropriately with that document, or it could rubber stamp it. That's an option it does have, I suppose. But if it doesn't want to rubber stamp, it's got to dig into that document. What are we voting on here? Let's take a look at this. And the board ends up being drawn into staff level thinking because it's approving what is mostly a staff level document. Not totally a staff level document. That's what throws us, because that's what makes it come to the board. Now, a lot of things happen out of that. The board gets into the approval syndrome. The board has to approve things. You end up with this document that once approved, we're still not sure what the board values were about it. Like when you pass a budget, you have no idea what the board values about fiscal planning are when you finish. All you have is a budget. You have numbers, you don't have the values. We know we had some values about fiscal planning, but we're not quite sure what they were because the board never spoke to those things. It only spoke to approval, disapproval. Let's go to the next graphic. I think it's 18.2, I believe, that shows the horizontal cut. Can we go to that? Good. Now you see here, the policy governance model that I developed has the board put its documents together this way. The board says, what do we as a board have to say about budgeting, fiscal planning? What do we have to say about treatment of personnel? What do we have to say about whatever the topic is? And the board answers its question at that level. When it's done that well, it can allow the CEO and others to answer it at their levels as long as they're consistent with what the board has said. Now I'm repeating, if you notice, what was said about that circle. But the board documents now don't look like they did before. They're much shorter. What the board has to say about personnel for most boards I've dealt with can be done in a page. What most boards have to say about budget, and this is surprising to most people, can be done in less than a page for most boards. In fact, I had a group of accountants one time, a whole board made up of only accountants. They could only come up with 2/3 of a page. That was it. Well, they came up with that after they got the idea. See, when they first tried to listen to this idea, they kept mishearing it until one member of the board said, "Oh, I understand. My job on this board is not to be an accountant." Right. That's the idea. But we import those inappropriate staff management kinds of roles into the boardroom, and we botch the job, unfortunately, by doing that. Now, that horizontal cut that you saw produces briefer, fewer, more empowering documents. More empowering. How are they more empowering? They're more empowering in that the board doesn't have to deal with a lot of little details. The board doesn't have to play like a group of staff members digging into little pieces in order to pass the document. It's more empowering for the staff because the staff has been given a document which deals with the broad level and lets them make up their minds about a lot of the smaller issues without having to pass that through a board committee or the board sieve to make sure board members say okay to all those little bits and pieces. So it's a more empowering document, and it's also at the same time required a higher level of conversation. We talk about something in a totally different way now. We talk about the big issues as a board, not the little issues. We inquire about the big things, not the little things. So the conversation that the board engages in is totally different. Now the result here is a few succinct board policies, packed with meaning, no trivia. It turns staff creativity loose, but within bounds. That's the important piece. Now, how on earth does a board produce these policies? How does it do it? Remember when we first started the first session, I dwelt on the ownership a little bit, the importance of that ownership group. Well, it really all starts back with the ownership, because the board, being the vessel of ownership expression, must take into its bosom, so to speak, the wide-ranging diversity that is true of that ownership. In other words, the board produces these policies by first reaching out to the diversity of values and perspectives, which then have to be pulled together, talked about, and something is arrived at. All right? So the board now is producing one voice out of diversity. And if you want a tough job, that's it. Value the diversity. Don't squelch it. Oh, for heaven's sakes, no. And don't just tolerate diversity. The point is not to tolerate it. The point is to love it. Love it. Love the rich variety of it and pull it together into one voice. Now, the one voice idea is terribly important. The board is not made up of individuals at this point. It's made up with one voice. The individuals are the embodiment of that. But it does not mean that the board votes unanimously. In fact, throw up graphic 19, if you will, because I want to make sure this principle gets burned in very tightly here. And the principle is this, that you have one voice as a board, or you don't have a voice at all. One or not at all. Not at all. It's like telling the staff, our job is to pull the diversity together and have the one voice. Your job is you have to pay attention to the one voice. Not the various voices that went into it, the one voice. And if you can't hear the one voice, we didn't speak yet. Now, a lot of boards skip that line and sort of hold the staff responsible for somehow figuring it all out. Just figure out what the board should have said. No, we've got to jump around that kind of thinking all the way. Well, it's something like boards firing their chief executive officers for violating the rule the board forgot to tell the CEO ahead of time. Now, the one voice idea does not mean unanimous votes. And I'm really afraid of unanimous votes. They scare me to death. Unanimous votes mean to me that the board is squelching its own dissent, or what is more likely, it's voting on things that weren't important enough to dissent on anyway. And if they weren't important enough to dissent on anyway, why are you wasting board time with them? You got more to do as a board than do ritualistic voting. Now, no single board member has any power here, but every member of the board has power to affect the total as it comes out in that one voice. What's funny about that is I don't find a great deal of opposition to that when I say that around the continent. People generally agree the board has one voice and that's it. When you think about it, they agree with that. But what I want to point out at this stage of the conference is that we have a number of ingrained traditions in which we routinely violate that very principle we say is important. Now, let's see graphic 20, because I want to throw up just a general picture here. This is a common one, right? You notice there's only one line connecting the board and the CEO. That's important. There's a message there. But we know the board is not a single body in a sense. Like, yes, we've dealt with the individual voices. Now, what I haven't dealt with are the ways in which the board divides itself up into groups. Because now we have a chance for ruining it all over again. Now, where does the board divide itself into groups? The first place it does is by having a chair at all. By having a chair, the board has divided some of its authority into one person. Now, we need that authority in the one person to help the board keep its job going well, and that's fine to have a chair. There's no problem with that, except that, as I've already pointed out with you, the chair has an opportunity to jump in and become more than just the chair of the board, become the supervisor of the CEO. And when the chair does that, we've just blown the one voice. Now the CEO works for the chair and the board. That's easily avoided. Another place where we do it routinely is by having a board treasurer. The board treasurer, and not all boards have a treasurer, but let's say a board that has a treasurer as a member of the board, and we have a CEO and we have a staff who handle all the fiscal events on staff. When that's the case, the board treasurer is an absolutely dysfunctional office. Unnecessary. But look what happens very often. We'll have the board treasurer check to see that the financial things are okay. Now, what does okay mean? In this model, okay means that they are in tune with the board's policies. The board has set some expectations, they're being met. But that's not what usually is done. The board, having skipped the step of setting the criteria, now has a treasurer to see if they're okay. The treasurer has to use his or her own criteria. There are no others to use. When anybody uses his or her own criteria to make judgments of staff performance, that person has just set expectations. The staff now works for the treasurer as well as the board. So we've broken the one voice down again. Of course, the renegade board member is an easy one. In fact, that's the easiest one to deal with. The board member who says, scratch this one voice stuff, I'm going to tell them what I need to tell them. I know more about that part of business. The city council member, for example, who tells Public Works to fix something, to do something a certain way, happens so normally that city council members all smile when I say that. Well, the renegade's easy to fix. We've talked about that. The board has to say what the relationship is with the CEO. Don't pay any attention to us individually unless we speak as a group. The board can fix that real easily. It's hard to fix it, though, when we have these other structural renegades built in, like chair and treasurer. But the really interesting place where boards violate the one voice rule is with committees. Oh my, we are committee happy. I was with a board last week that had 27 committees. Now that's a little over the average, certainly, but it happens so often. Let's look at graphic 21, because I want you to see what I would suggest to you as the main principle about committees to keep in mind. And this one's a very simple one. If you have a board committee, and you don't have to have any, but if you choose to have a committee, that committee, board members, is to help you do your job as a board, not to help the staff. Don't ever have a board committee to help or advise staff on anything. Oh my, well, why not? Don't they need help? Don't they need advice? They're grown-ups. They're grown-ups. They can get advice anytime they want to, and if they happen to ask board members, that's okay. But they're in charge of the advice getting, you see. If they're in charge of getting the help or getting the advice, then they'll make it work. But if the board's in charge of advising them, well, a lot of things get a little bit screwy about that. For one thing, I can guarantee you there won't be the same persons the board will choose to advise staff as the persons the staff would have chosen because their advice is valuable to them. There's a message in that. Also, once you advise staff, what if they don't follow your advice? Have you really given an instruction under the guise of advice, and the instruction came from a group, not the board? Subgroup. We busted up the one voice business. It's so simple to avoid that. If the board needs committees, it has committees to help it do its own job. That's all. You can go ahead and turn it, David. The board has no obligation to use committees, all right? But if it does have committees, it's to help it do its own job. Now, what might that look like? The main way that board committees, when they're legitimate, work for the board is to help do pre-board work, not sub-board work. That is, they are studying an issue before the board gets to it. A board-level issue, not a staff-level issue, a board issue, and looking at that issue from the standpoint of what are the options available to this board? It could say this or say this or say that. What are the implications for going one way versus another? Now, when that committee job is done, the board has something to go on. You have options and implications, not one recommendation, mind you, options. Intelligent people make choices from among options. You get the options and the implications and you argue those out, you do whatever fighting you need to do to really hammer this sucker out, and you make a choice. And when you make the choice, it is the board's choice, not the committee's choice, and you haven't duplicated the effort. Not at all. Let me say a word about a special kind of committee, though, before I leave committees. It's very common to have something called an executive committee. Oh, that's sort of like the committee that's a little more equal than the other committees, you know. And sometimes they're so more equal than the other committees that the executive committee appears to be running things. Instead of the executive committee working for the board, sometimes it seems like the board is working for the executive committee. We have insiders and outsiders. That's unfortunate. It's also very common to put an executive committee between the board and its CEO. And it's also common for boards to say that executive committee has the power to act for the board between board meetings. Very common. Now think of it for a minute. If you give an executive committee the power to act, that power has to reduce the power of the board or the power of the CEO or both. There's no place else it can come from. So as a result, having an executive committee chances, I'm saying chance because the executive committee may never meet. They could choose not to use it, I suppose. But the board is taking the chance of weakening governance or management or both at the same time. Executive committees, particularly when a board meets as often as once a month, and maybe even once a quarter, but certainly once a month, you've got to ask, if we're dealing or have the option of dealing with governance level issues more than once a month, does that not mean the board's operating up too close to its nose? Does that not mean we've not delegated enough authority? That's usually the situation, by the way. So executive committees are not exempt from this little study we're doing here. Now I know that's not much time on those issues, but teleconferences being what they are, we need to rush right on to something else. Let's look at something some of you have been waiting for since we started, and that is monitoring staff performance. Because it's one thing for the board to get in the driver's seat, so to speak, and say, we want these kinds of results for people at this kind of cost, and we want you to stay within certain kinds of prudence and ethics limitations. We've said all that as carefully as we could. Now, how on earth do you know it's being carried out? Because you're not there all the time. You're one step removed. So let's look at the board getting the information it needs. And that's good. Let's throw up this graphic about the types of information, because in order to talk about monitoring, I want to separate it out for some other things. One kind of information you need is that which allows the board to make good decisions. Now, this is different from monitoring. I'll get to monitoring in a minute. This means as the board creates these policies, particularly around ends issues, it needs to gather information, it needs to get smart, it needs to be educated, it needs to be trained, it needs a lot of input. I can even see a board spending 1/3 to 1/2 of its time simply in board education to make good decisions. You don't need to make many, but you better make good ones. Let's look at another kind of information, totally different. The kind of information that does monitor. Now, monitoring of staff, which means in this setting monitoring of the CEO, means simply that you're saying, did we get what we want and did we not get what we didn't want, given those two areas of policies you're checking here. Monitoring is a judgmental activity. It's directly related to the CEO's job performance. The monitoring comes out well, the CEO got the job done. Monitoring doesn't come out well, the CEO didn't get the job done. There's a direct connection there. Monitoring is judgmental, it's focused. It should be more like rifle fire than a shotgun blast. It's not tell us everything. It's we need to know this and this and this and this. See, the tell us everything approach has been with us a long time. When boards fail to set the criteria ahead of time, what they do in answer to that is to say something like, if you just cover us up with enough information and enough reports, we therefore will have monitored by virtue of being covered up. Well, frankly, folks, too much information is worse than none. And boards now get too much. If you get none, you at least know you have none. If you get too much, you're not real sure. Right? You're covered up with that stuff. And I'll bet you right now, if we could possibly poll all the board members who are taking part in this teleconference, those people are reading themselves silly. Or at least feeling guilty about the fact that they didn't, one or the other. Right? Let's pour over more reports. So let's look at one more type of information now. Incidental information. Now this one's easily defined. It's not the first one or the second one. Anything that doesn't fit those. So you have to get information to make good decisions. You have to get the information that allows you to monitor performance. And as human beings, we also want some other things. Now, there's nothing wrong with this, except when we get it mixed up. Incidental information. Well, most of what's in your financial report's incidental information. You don't need to know it. Most. of what's in there you don't need to know. Most of what's in staff reports, you don't need to know it. Most of what we inquire about and spend board time doing is incidental information, as it turns out. Not bad. It's just crowding out what needs to be done. Crowding it out. Usually crowding out by having this incidental, pour it all over us kind of information masquerade, if you will, as monitoring. But it also masquerades for the other kind, but monitoring is where the masquerade usually happens more. You see the monitoring principle that I'm using here in graphic 23, if you can throw that up for a minute. It's a very simple principle. The only monitoring you do is against criteria you've already set. Now, if I said that a little more inelegantly, it would be something like this. If you haven't said how it ought to be, don't ask how it is. Now, that seems a little harsh, doesn't it? It doesn't apply to decision information, but it applies to monitoring. And the reason I say it that way is because we let ourselves as boards off the hook for setting criteria by going to monitor that about which we have not set criteria, and we're back into that old soup again. So only monitor what you've set criteria about. How do you set the criteria? You set ends policies about the output expectations of the organization. You set limitations or staff limitations policies about those limits within which the staff must stay as they're producing the ends. That's what you monitor. Nothing else, just that. And notice there's a 1-2 punch here. There's a 1-2 punch here. First you set an expectation, second you see if you got it. Now that's simple enough that I shouldn't take expensive teleconference time to say it, but we violate it every time we turn around. You set an expectation, then you see if you got it. What we are trying to do in traditional board operation is skip step 1, go directly to step 2. That's what you do every time you try to approve a budget. You're approving against what criteria, for heaven's sakes? What criteria are there? We didn't have them. We're just going to approve it. You see, if you approve something, the criteria must be in the back of your heads someplace. And by saying this is okay or not okay, the criteria have sort of, though not explicitly, so we can't tell later what they were, been set on the fly. We don't need to govern that way. It's a sloppy kind of governance that lets boards and staffs off the hook and cheats all of what we're about. Well, having said that, let's look a little bit more at the mechanics of monitoring. How do you monitor? How do you do that? Sure, we need information about the criteria, but what are those? How do we do that? Well, I've got 3 different methods of monitoring that I'd suggest to you. One of those methods is the executive report. In other words, the board has set a policy. The chief executive officer is told to produce the data that address the degree of performance on that policy every month, every quarter, every year, some frequency. The board picks a frequency too. The executive report. Now that report is direct. A balance sheet or an income statement, by the way, fails the test because it's not directly answering the question. We look to the policy to see what the questions are. The question is always, is this criterion met? Is this criterion met? Is this criterion met? Those show up in the policies. The monitoring report tracks that exactly. Board, you set a criterion. You said this, here's what the data are. You said the criterion here are what the data are, and so forth. So the direct report by the executive. Now that's the cheapest and the easiest way to get the monitoring data, but it's not the only way. Let's go to another way. The external report. In the case of an external report, the board is looking to an outsider, maybe a disinterested party, a third party, an expert, like an auditor, for example, but it wouldn't have to just be fiscal auditing, to look inside the workings of the organization and tell the board the degree to which performance has occurred given the board's policies, not given the outside person's values. That's a little different. Let's look at one more method. A third method of monitoring is where the board basically goes and looks. You put documents in front of you and you look them over. You go visit the service locations, whatever, but the board goes and looks. It may take a portion of the board, like a committee or an officer perhaps, but the board itself is doing this, it's not being abstracted by someone else. And the board goes and looks, and that's a third way of board monitoring. Now, I want to point out to you that the problem about monitoring is usually not in the monitoring. The problem of boards about monitoring is in not having stated the criteria to begin with. That's where the biggest problem in monitoring occurs. If you do that, the monitoring part may not become a piece of cake, but it gets mighty close in most instances. With regard to monitoring ends, which gives people a little more difficulty, I suggest to you that you go ahead and allow yourselves to be embarrassed that we won't do it really well. We need to do it as well as we can. That is, if you say as a board, here's the effect we want to have on kids coming through the school system, here, or as a family planning agency, here's the effect we want to have on people who are making family decisions or whatever else. In your ends work. Or trade association. Here is the environment in which we want our members to be able to practice their commerce, whatever the situation is. I suggest that you remember an old management maxim that'll come in handy at this point, especially when we get so we've had beaten into our heads that we have to have measurable objectives all the time. The maxim is this: a crude measure of the right thing beats a precise measure of the wrong thing. And what we've tended to do is we raced for the precise measures, even though they measure the wrong things, and left the crude measure behind when it would have done just as well. At least it would have had the power on organizational direction of pushing it this way or that way much better than measuring the wrong things. What are the wrong things? Oh, one of the wrong things in a lot of our service organizations is unit cost, a ludicrous measure that pretends it's measuring productivity. It does not. It measures official busyness. So we have a lot of ways in which we measure the wrong thing. Schools are more precise about measuring teacher certification than they are about whether kids learn, and so forth. It goes on and on and on. Well, let me shift on you again, another topic, because the kinds of things I'm laying out for you certainly require board discipline, perhaps beyond the discipline that some of our boards have. We can have disciplined individuals who become an undisciplined group. The group has to take responsibility for its discipline, and that has to do with its process. It has to do with the topics it talks about, all of those things. And we pinned the chair as being a person who's the point person of that discipline, but I don't want to let the rest of the board members off the hook, because if it's only the chair who maintains the discipline of the board, we have blown it again. If the board is off task, if the board is getting into things it said it wouldn't do, and so forth, every board member who does not raise a hand and say, hey, wait a minute, folks, is culpable. Every board member. And until every board member feels that responsibility, we'll never take care of it by making the chair responsible. By the way, if you're on a large board, it's harder to do that. Small boards are more easy to take responsibility than large ones. But even if you are on a large one, discuss that in your board. Set that up as an expectation. Now, the reason I say discuss it is because if you as an individual start doing it, you're going to look more like a troublemaker than someone who's being responsible. All right, so discuss it as a body first. But see, I'm backing myself into position here. In order to talk about board discipline and getting the board job done, we better talk about the board's job just a second. What does it look like? And on the screen you see a graphic entitled Board Job Products. The board could produce a lot of things, but these are the three things you've got to produce as a board, otherwise you're not getting your governance job done. Number one is a linkage with the ownership. Having that link in place between the organization proper and its ownership is a board piece. You put that piece in place. You are responsible for the integrity and the completeness of that linkage. The second board job product, I'm putting this in terms of products, not activities, for obvious reasons, I hope at this point, is that the organization have written governing policies, the ones the board produces. Though the staff policies, we leave that to them. That's no problem. Have written governing policies, and those we've talked about in terms of 4 categories so far today. A third job output of the board is the assurance of executive performance. Now, by assurance, I don't mean that you do the executive performance, no. But unless you make sure it happened, then the board is culpable again. Now, there are other job products you can add to that. For some boards, having a legislative impact of some sort, the board takes on for itself. Or it may add donor funding, going out and finding money. Nothing wrong with that. It's more important, by the way, for a board to govern an organization worth raising money for than it is to raise money. We've sometimes got off on the money-raising piece as the big piece. No, it's not the big piece, but it might be, for some kinds of organizations, extraordinarily important. So I'm not meaning to play the importance down here, but just to put it in order. It follows governing. It doesn't replace it by any means. Now, that's the board's job description, if you will. I mentioned earlier that the board's meetings should be the board's meetings, and said a few words about constructing the agenda, but let me give that to you in a little more organized fashion. If you start with that long-term picture of what the board's for, that board job description, another way of looking at a job description is perpetual agenda. It is the perpetual agenda. That's what we're always working on, producing those things. If that's the perpetual agenda, then the board, at an interim basis, maybe every year or every 2 years, whatever works for your board, backs off, takes stock, and said, look, this is our job to make these 3 things happen. I want you to notice, by the way, if the board makes those 3 things happen, it's done all it needed to do. The organization has performed. You didn't do the performing, but it must have performed for it to come out that way. All right? So you focus on your job, and the rest of it gets done. So all throughout this, the board focusing on getting its job done well is all you have to do. Get your job done well, you don't have to worry about the staff's piece, except as that's in the assurance part. All right, so the board looks at that perpetual agenda or job description and says, over the next year, 2 years, whatever we're using as our time span here for board planning, not agency planning, board planning, here are the parts that need to be beefed up. Our linkage with the ownership is not nearly as thorough as it should be, or the thought that goes into our ends work, our ends discussions, our ends policies is not nearly as deep or inclusive as other people as it ought to be, and, or whatever it is. The board looks at those things and says, no matter how good we've been, we can be better. Where are we going to put our efforts? And it looks at that next year, let's say, as a period in which it brings itself back around to a stopping point better off than we ended last year's. Now the board can do this work in more or less detail. It might be very detailed about, well, this means we need to do this in February and this in March and so forth. Or it may not get that detailed at all. Think of that as coming in on the circle, more detailed or less detailed, because the more detail the board gets, the less work there is for the chair to do to figure out exactly what goes on in those meetings. The less detail the board is, the more range of latitude for the chair to decide such things, but in either event, somebody decides it. There's not an orphan issue here. It's owned by somebody. The chair takes it the rest of the way. Did we show graphic 26, or am I ahead of myself? Let's show graphic 26 then, because this is what I'd like for you to remember is a summary bit of what I've just said. Is that we take that job description and we make it good enough that it becomes the leverage from which we then project annual, midterm of some sort, and actual meeting agendas. You work right out of that. Now in this way, the board has controlled its own agenda. Well, let me summarize a few places about where we are here at this point. And if we'll go to graphic 27, I'm going to give you a drawing that's a little different from the ones we've thrown up, but you'll recognize it because it has some elements of some pieces we've already seen. So just leave that drawing up, if you will, for a few minutes and let me explain it. Conceive of the big circle, the one that's too big for the screen, the one that just goes way on out there, as the ownership. Lots of people. It might be a few thousands, it may be millions. A board, small group within the ownership. I might say cynically, it may not be small enough to get its job done well, but a small group within that total ownership. That board is being the microcosm of the ownership, or the vessel through which the ownership speaks, and so forth. The board is connected to a chief executive officer who oversees staff operations which lead to certain ends that the board has prescribed and stay within, those orange lines on the outside, stay within certain boundaries the board has described. And if you look at this, this in itself tells us something about the board policy areas. Let me have graphic 27.1 because we're going to close in on that top part. In the top part, where the ownership and the board show up, forget the yellow part now, at that point we're discussing governance process policies. How does this board take its place with that ownership context and somehow do its job of bringing that diversity together? What are the mechanics of that? What are the ways we do that? What's our job in doing it? Like the job description I just gave you, those are our outputs. That's what governance process policies direct themselves to, is the ownership connection with the board and the board's inner workings. Let's go to the next graphic, which focuses now on that connection. The board is connected here with the CEO. It's not connected with all the other staff members. It's connected with the chief executive officer only. Keep that up for a minute because I want to make sure you understand. I am not saying board members and staff members cannot talk. I am not saying there has to be this paranoid atmosphere of, my God, we saw a board member meeting with a staff member. What does that mean? In fact, that kind of paranoia comes out when we don't have the roles clear. Because when you do have them clear as this drawing, the board instructs only one person. The board judges only one person. Now, having said that and made that very clear, and we're going to live with it, now anybody can talk to anybody about anything and nothing is harmed. The school board member can talk with a teacher. The Board of Health member can talk with a nurse in the Board of Health operations. It doesn't hurt anything. Now we take chances of it hurting a lot because the rules aren't clear enough to save us from that. And it's a very artificial thing when human beings can't talk with each other. This lets that lighten up. Let's look at the next one. Move down to the lower part of the drawing, 27.3 I think it is. And here we have two things showing the staff means, and of course you know what policies that deals with, and the ends, the policies that deals with. Now I'll tell you what, it turns out that I can't really tell you how many of these policies you need, but I can tell you what it usually is. Usually there are approximately, I don't know, 7 or 8 pages of these staff limitations. Just 7 or 8. There are maybe 4 or 5 of the board staff relationship policies. There may be 5 or 6 of the governance process policies. Now the numbers I'm giving you are just rules of thumb. They are not accurate. They're not researched. That's just the range in which it usually falls. Your board may be totally different. Ends, well, see, when you get to ends, now we're really talking about that which makes your organization really unique. What normal folks will put down as prudence limitations comes out about the same whether you're on the board of the Red Cross or on the board of a hospital. So those don't seem to vary very much. In fact, the policies about governance process, board staff relationship, and staff limitations are very stable. Once the board has them in place, and it's much better to put them in place as fast as you possibly can, not string it out over 2 years. Once you have those in place, they're very stable. They tend to stay pretty much the way they were. You'll adjust them a little bit here and there. You'll change something here, change something there, and that's fine. You can do it anytime you want to. You can come into more detail, back up. All that's flexible, all of it's fluid. But the ends, those aren't so stable. In fact, the mission level might be pretty stable, but get below that, and you find that the board is constantly having to re-look at those ends, constantly having to re-explore, constantly having to raise the issue, are we really thinking big enough? Has something which has happened in our world, maybe it's a community, maybe it's a nation, has something that's going on caused us to need to swing our focus from this to that? Somebody's filling that need now. They weren't before. Now we can move it over here. And the board's doing this with a long-term perspective, looking out several years. So when the board does its ends work with a long-term perspective, it has just done its part of long-range planning. There are a few exceptions to that, but not much. In other words, the board does not do long-range planning, people. No, the board gets out of long-range planning. It has a lot of nuts and bolts in it. The trivia of tomorrow is no more righteous than the trivia of today, for heaven's sakes. Get out of long-range planning, but get into with both feet and energetically long-range visioning. What are we here for? And then what happens to planning out of that, by the way? I'm still dealing with the ends piece here. Plans are those things which get you to those visions. In other words, the vision is that toward which plans plan. So the board has participated in long-range planning much better by staying just outside of it, never getting caught in the nuts and bolts of it. And it's iterative. It goes back and forth. The board's working on this. The staff's feeding information back and forth. Yes, folks, you could say this, but this is what would happen. Well, golly, let's take another look at that. You have to work on it. It stays working. Now, what happens out of that is that most board work then, after you get past the hump of getting these policies in place, if you truly follow the principles, and I'm saying that because you have to keep working at that. They slide away from you. You have to come back and make sure they stay in place. Most board work, by far, is on 2 things. Number 1, it's on continual, obsessive consideration and re-exploration of ends. That's what you're there for. 2, a continual and increasingly high-integrity conversation with the ownership about the choices that need to be made about ends. Now, do we show graphic 28 while I wasn't looking? Ah, yes. Now, this speaks in terms of a community board, but it really applies to any board. Our community board's a little easier to see. It's up close. It's right in town with us, right? So we can see it working with the ownership. We can see it much closer. But the same principle applies to any board. It could be a national federation or something else of that nature. Now I want to do something else at this point. You see what happens, and we can see this in graphic 28.1. What happens is the board ends up putting its effort on ends and on the dialogue with ownership so much that all of that intriguing, sometimes confusing, and certainly overwhelming material in the middle, all that the staff is doing, in other words, what boards have spent most of their time looking at, becomes relatively invisible. That's not what it's all about. Your job is not keeping up with that. Your job is not managing that. Your job is creating the vision toward which all that goes and talking with the people you represent to make that happen. So interestingly enough, the board is freed from a tremendous amount of work of that sort. But don't get me wrong, you're not freed from work because the other is an even harder kind of work. Probably enough about that. Let me shift to a different topic and move us on to a different place. The kind of governance I've talked about with you. The kind of governance is certainly visionary for single organizations. And it's empowering for your staff as well as the board. But there's really a bigger payoff waiting than that. And the bigger payoff is when the board really understands that its primary connection is with the ownership, not the staff. And it goes a step further and really understands that that same ownership, or at least close to the same ownership, has other boards representing it as well. If you're on the library board in your community, there's a city council, a school board, a mental health board, sometimes a home nursing board, a hospital board. The list goes on of people who in fact are working for the same boss, the same ownership. And yet these boards, typically in the U.S. and Canada, do not talk with each other. I just want to point that out to you. Boards don't talk to boards. Now, my goodness, they don't have time. They're so busy staying on top of all this stuff they're governing, there's no energy or time left to talk with other boards. That would be asking too much of them. But when you change the nature of governance, then not only is it possible for them to have that time, it becomes probable that they will reach out for that, because you can't really do the ends on behalf of the ownership unless you talk with other people who are doing the same thing, even though they're doing it with a different line of work. See, my picture, and go ahead and flip to graphic 29 for this, but my picture is a new level of civic trusteeship wherein boards talk with boards about governance issues, mainly two things: ends issues and how can we govern better and better and better. All right? The plane of conversation jumps up magnificently, because at this point boards are doing what they're there to do. They're governing on behalf of people, and they're coordinating with each other as they do it. This is not staff talking to staff. That's a totally different kind of interaction. This is a piece of community leadership connection that we have not even touched the hem of the garment of. That's the part I get most excited about, as a matter of fact. Well, let me give you a warning label. I developed this model of governance. At the time I did it, I felt like a voice crying in the wilderness, but now with books and tapes and video conferences and travel, it's like I'm becoming establishment, and I'm not quite sure what to do with that. But I developed this model to bring a more meaningful and powerful way to do that piece of management, the governance piece of management. And it does work. It works magnificently. But it's not all good. The biggest thing to watch out for is this: partial implementation. If you take a piece of a new paradigm and plug it into an old one, you might be worse off than when you started. This is a new paradigm, not just tips, which means you've got a whole picture. Be careful about importing pieces of a different picture. I fly all over the U.S. and Canada at a rate that makes absolutely no sense. It's a bit of insanity, the amount I do it. 3 times a week in the U.S. and Canada, helping boards do just the kind of governance we're talking about. I usually fly on airplanes lately that are more modern, they're quiet, relatively quiet, fast, comfortable. And I can remember flying on some that weren't that way 20 years ago. You know, if I'd been back there 20 years ago and I'd been in one of those airplanes, I said, you know, if I could foresee what's going to be in a 767, I want to import some of that right into this airplane. Sure. You want trouble in a hurry? Take a bit of a totally different system and try inserting it in that one. Got real problems. It has to work as a system. So be very careful. You can get in big trouble partially implementing. Well, our time's drawing to a close and getting ready for those questions. So let me summarize this piece then, and then I'll stop. That governance, the way I'm envisioning it, and I hope the way you are, is not about budget lines. It's not about personnel practices. It's not about the intricacies of program or curriculum. It's not about making the proper group insurance purchases. That's not what it's about. Governance is about values. It's about strategic leadership. It's about vision, dreaming even. That's what it's about. And if you keep in mind, even though you're working in one boardroom with one staff, that there's something bigger, that really you're not running an organization. What you're really about is creating a world. That's what governance is about.
John, here's one from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. How can a board using a different style switch over to your board style? And how should the board organization handle the turnover of styles?
Making the changeover is a very ticklish kind of thing, I think, for a lot of boards. The first thing you have to do as a board is really talk about your governance process itself. In other words, focus on your own process so you can reach some conclusion about how you want to be. All right? It's very important to have that in place. You don't just start doing things. You draw the blueprint of where you're going to get to be. Then, I suggest you get there as quickly as you can. Don't take a long time doing it if you can do it fast. And the reason is, when you start, it's like bringing those parts of the old airplane. You want to change from this airplane to that airplane. Now, I realize that's kind of difficult because you don't have the new one built yet. I also realize that when you swing from one trapeze to the next trapeze, you have got to let go of the first one before you get the second one. And there's a moment of sheer panic right in between. Well, you want to reduce the panic because, as you know, a scared board is a dangerous board. Well, all of you may know it. Those of you who are chief executives know it very well. So the board needs to have, first then, its vision about what kind of governance it wants to use. Second, put in on paper those policies which represent a total adoption of the new way. They're not in effect yet, but you've thought through them, they're on paper. Now you say, at what point can we make this come to pass? We'll put a date certain. Between now and that date, we'll have a legal, if it takes it, or certainly administrative check to see if replacing all the old with the new leaves some balls dropping that shouldn't have dropped. So we run that kind of check to make sure it's safe, and then we do it. Be sure the monitoring system's in place and all those pieces as you do it. I know that's a scary kind of thing. Change is, particularly when you're jumping a whole type of operation.
We have a live call right now, though, from Bend, Oregon. Let's see how that works. So,
great. Let's hear Bend, and I think it's coming through clearly now.
If you go ahead, please.
John, this is Jim Lucier from Central Oregon Community College.
Hello, Jim.
Bend, Oregon. How does the board or CEO reconcile the differences in board members for the desired level of delegation to the CEO and/or specific requests for information from operations?
Okay, Jim, let me, thanks for the question. Let me deal with those, and I'll try to hold question 2 in mind when we do question 1. The way you deal with the fact that board members differ in how much they want to delegate is the way you deal with every other difference. You talk it through, you make the big decisions about that first. For example, what's the nature of delegation, and then how far do we go with it? It comes down to a vote. And the whole board has to do it the way the vote went. A lot of discussion first, yes. But at some point, if you wait till everybody agrees, you're causing the organization far more damage, because while they're waiting to agree, they're all approaching it a different way. So I say, first of all, board, don't let yourselves off the hook. Everybody's not going to agree about anything, including the depth of the delegation or the extent of delegation. That's where the one voice has to have itself heard. Now, as far as what was the other piece? What am I forgetting? I got you.
Yes, you did.
Jim asked one other question. It had to do with, my goodness, don't tell me. Right in the middle of all this, I've forgotten the second half of his question. I bet he's off the line.
I bet he is too. I'm sorry about that.
That's a clever way, if you're doing a teleconference, if you don't know the answer to the...
John, we do have another question.
I was going to enjoy the second one more than the first one, actually. So.
I'm sorry we forgot it.
Yeah, I am too. We'll get Jim later.
The University of Dayton's called in a question. They want to know, they say, please talk about boards talking to boards. Talk about consequences that occur in this situation, or talk about communities that this is presently occurring in.
Well, I can answer the second one real fast. I don't know.
Okay.
By the way, there are little pieces of that going on some places, all right? But the extent to where this becomes an ingrained way of operating in the community, I don't know. I truly don't. I do know of some early efforts in Georgia. In fact, even published an article in the Economic Development Review a couple of years ago citing some of those things, but I don't know where they are now. Right? So I don't know. The consequences of boards talking with boards, I'm going to have to give you theory, folks, because it's sort of an untested thing. My statements about it are really a belief statement, not that this has been done and it works well. I don't know. We haven't developed that far yet. I think one of the consequences, though, is that boards, you know, there's some safety in being in a little shell someplace. That shell gets just broken all to pieces because we find out we're in business with a lot of other people. The board also would have to find out that it can't be in the same turf protection position as its staff, because the board isn't there to protect the turf. The board is there to represent the public, if it's a community board. And the public doesn't care about the turfs of staff members in different organizations. It cares that the job gets done. At least we certainly hope that's what the public's caring about, don't we? Now, the job may mean that boards need to seriously examine the division of labor among the organizations. It may be the division of labor where we started out shouldn't be the same anymore. I was always, when I was a mental health work, a proponent of the fact that the mental health work of children ought to take place in the schools, not in the mental health centers. That was a personal point of view. But see, that would have taken a shift of where the division of labor fell. Well, I don't know that that one's smart or not smart. My point is simply that when boards get together talking about what's best for the community or best for the ownership that they represent, whatever that is, then they have to free themselves of the relative safety and simplicity of sticking with the same turfs we've had for a long time. That's certainly going to be one of the consequences.
We have a caller waiting on the line. Would you identify yourself and where you're calling from and ask your question now, please?
Hi, this is Terre Haute, Indiana. Many of us here today face the ongoing challenge of fundraising to stay alive in our organizations. You've defined the difference between board members and governance and the volunteers who help. Does it follow that board members do not have any individual responsibility for raising funds?
No, it doesn't. Thank you from Terre Haute. No, it does not follow that they have no responsibility. You see, the first step is for the board to say, what is the board's responsibility about creating resources here for this organization? I suggest you get to that, by the way, through the ends route. As you look at your dream, you determine how much that dream runs off and leaves the otherwise available resources. Now, there'll be a gap there. You've got to do something with that gap. You either back off on your dream or you find a way to find the resources, and perhaps that would be the board's finding the resources. And if that's what you take, that route of the board's going to find resources to make this dream stretch. Now the board has to deal with its own internal mechanics of, okay, what does that mean each one of us has just inherited here? What are we agreeing to as individuals? And the board has to deal with working that out. So my comment earlier doesn't mean that the board members wouldn't have that, but it does mean that the board would determine what the individual member's responsibility would be as the board works through its own process about getting its job done. At that point, then, the board could use any number of fundraising methods to do it. There are lots available, and I'm certainly not an expert in that.
John, a conferee in Sioux Falls, South Dakota is waiting. Go ahead, please.
Hello, I'm Susan Peterson from the University of South Dakota in Sioux Falls. And the first question is, does this model that you were discussing this afternoon work with a very small nonprofit organization? For example, a two-member staff with a board working along very closely with that staff?
Oh, very good question. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just certain that in the teleconference audience there are a number of people who have either no CEO, no chief executive officer, or have virtually no staff. And the questioner gives a good example of that. Let me suggest you do this. Pretend for a minute you have no staff at all. I mean, none, not even a couple. But you do have a board, and you put yourselves together because you have some interest in something happening in the world. Now, what I'm recommending to you is that you keep your role as a board member broken into two parts here. These two parts are usually obscured, so we run them together.